Good morning and good afternoon, and welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. My name is Jacob Kurtzer. I'm a senior associate with the Humanitarian Agenda. We thank you all for joining us today for this important conversation on the humanitarian situation in Yemen and the way in which the international community needs to adapt and evolve our aid portfolio. We're lucky and grateful to be joined today by David Gressley, the resident humanitarian coordinator for Yemen, as well as Fatima Abu al-Asrar, a non-resident senior associate at the Middle East Institute. Today's conversation comes in the wake of the expiration of a humanitarian truce. For those of us who have worked on Yemen or covered Yemen's humanitarian crisis for many years, we've in a way run out of negative superlatives to talk about the humanitarian crisis there. The conflict in Yemen, which has taken so many lives and caused such great humanitarian catastrophe, manifests in a country that was already quite poor and quite underdeveloped and facing many severe development and human development challenges. And on top of that, you then had a devastating armed conflict with the impacts on civilian infrastructure. And as our program at CSIS has had a focus on humanitarian access, we've seen in Yemen throughout the conflict the various different ways in which all the manifestations of access denial have emerged, from the very simple blocking of trucks or workers at checkpoints and borders, to the more substantive blockades, to the infrastructure challenges that are faced, to the decision by organizations to take difficult but necessary decisions not to act for safety and security reasons. We've also seen the challenges that manifest as a result of donor decisions, bureaucratic, regulatory constraints related to counterterrorism regulations and otherwise have also had their impact on the ability of the humanitarian community, but also the civil society and business communities to support the humanitarian needs in Yemen. So we're very grateful today, again, for your joining us and to be with Mr. Gressley and with Ms. Abu al-Asrar to discuss these very important issues. So I want to start with you, David, joining us from Yemen. In your capacity as the UN representative, can you tell us about the current status and the challenges for the Yemeni people, and what, if any, notable ways you've observed those conditions changing since the breakdown or the ending of the truce in October?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. Actually, I think it's a tale of two separate stories. I think the experience among the population that's in the Ansar Allah controlled areas is actually different than those who are in the government of Yemen controlled areas. And so I'll describe each of them separately in terms of impact. And to summarize, it's basically a greater positive impact in the north than in the south. Probably a reflection of the way the truce has been implemented, particularly the implementation of the opening of the airport and relatively free movement of fuel vessels coming into the port of Hodeidah. And also the cessation of the air campaign. These have all had a significant impact positive impact on people in the north. And the opening of the airport has given some hope certainly for medical treatment, educational access, etc., that did not exist before. So that's helpful for the individuals, of course, but also generally the morale of people as well. The more significant support would be the opening of the port. We no longer are seeing fuel shortages. Sometimes they've been artificially created. I think I have to acknowledge that by authorities in the north. But nonetheless, we've seen that problem cease much better than I saw January through March of this year, where there was actually very little petrol or gasoline to be purchased throughout the country, fuel oil, other essential petroleum products in extremely short or no supply. That's no longer the issue. So people are able to move freely now. They're able to keep businesses open, factories open that closed because they couldn't generate electricity. So people's incomes are better. And then the third area is actually the cessation of the air campaign, which was quite brutal in the period January through March in terms of its impact on civilians. It was just the intensity of it and the wider spread of that was particularly hard. That too, of course, has a major morale impact as well as not causing the disruptions that it did before. And moving around Sana'a or other parts of the country, places like Hodeidah, for example, have come back to life. People are moving back there. And it's become a city again. Sana'a, people seem to be more relaxed moving around. You see work to remove rubble of air raids of the past years, which I think is a forward-looking kind of approach. Streets in the city are being paved, so there's some investments coming in and so forth. I say that understanding that the overall context from a human rights point of view, good governance point of view is still very poor. So I don't want to paint a totally rosy picture, but certainly for individuals, it's much better than it was prior to the truce. In the South, it's interesting. We've had colleagues do surveys of IDP intentions, and they're actually quite negative. Partly because some of the aspects of the truce that were intended was the opening of the roads in Taiz, for example. So IDPs in that area are quite disappointed. They're not seeing a benefit. They saw a drop off in food assistance, which was not really linked to the truce. It was much more linked to the drop off in regional support for humanitarian assistance in the first part of the year. But people make the connection differently. They saw because it coincided with the truce. Some have even said they would prefer going back to war because they were better supported at that point in time. So I think we have a problem of dichotomy of both expectations and what's been realized. The benefits of peace are much more apparent in the AA-controlled areas than they are in the government of Yemen-controlled areas, which remains divided, increased criminality. We know the military campaigns that are going on in the south, not as disruptive as perhaps the air attacks in the north, but nonetheless an element that people have to live with. So it's really two different stories in Yemen in the overall impact. And I think it's important that we focus on the South and how they too can benefit from this is one of the key things I would take from this. But that's probably a long answer to your question. I'll stop there.
That's great. And there's a lot of points that I'd like to pick up on there. But I want to turn to Fatima. Before I do, I was remiss in my introduction in not acknowledging this partnership with USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance that allows us to put on events like today's. So just want to flag that. But let me turn to you, Fatima. You've your research and your background has engaged both questions around international development, but also about violence prevention. And I'm curious from your perspective, having written quite a bit about the conflict in Yemen and the truce, how have you seen the truce impacting humanitarian needs and the expiration of it? How has that impacted the situation on the ground?
Thank you, David. Jacob, for the opportunity, and a pleasure meeting you virtually, David. So the truce was not perfect in any way, but it had undoubtedly some positive outcomes. Just David touched upon them. In the Houthi-controlled areas, certainly, just life has come back to the city. And as we know, that there has been a conflict going on in Ma'rib, in the city of Ma'rib, for the past a couple of years due to the Houthis' interest in the area in expansion. And seeing that stop momentarily was a huge issue for the citizens in Ma'rib. So it allowed people some rest. It allowed, I think it was really positive in many ways. We also saw some positivity in Shabwa, where earlier on in this year there was attacks by the Houthis, and now all of these have dissipated to a huge extent during the truce. Where there is a dichotomy, as mentioned, is that this is not impacted or not felt everywhere in Yemen. So as David mentioned, the city of Taiz remains one of the cities that are greatly affected by the blockade or the siege that the Houthis have implemented. And Taiz is no small city. It's the third most populated city in Yemen. And there were some political messages that people were basically taking from the truce, given the lack of implementation in Taiz and given its failure in Taiz, is the idea that the airports were open for the Houthis to travel regionally, but at the same time in Taiz, people cannot travel within their own city to go to the hospitals or go to meet family members that are 10 minutes away from them, but due to the blockade, their journey becomes 6 to 8 hours to travel and to cross. So there's also other political messages that were coming through, is that the international community might have over-focused on the truce from the perspective of aerial attacks by the Saudis and also cross-border attacks from the Houthis to the Saudi areas, somewhat neglecting the skirmishes that are happening on the ground and the continuous shelling by the Houthi militia. According to international organizations, the Houthis were responsible for over 93% of violence, artillery shelling, drone attacks, and about 95% of the death toll in Yemen during the truce period. There were 504 people reported to be killed, of which 479 were killed by the Houthi militia. So from that perspective, people saw the failure. They saw the failure, more pronounced in Taiz, and the political messages that came with that is that political or instability is going to be created by the non-state armed group without having any type of security guarantees from the government or from the coalition to help stabilize these areas. And we see this also in the delivery of humanitarian aid, where there's a lot of interest in supporting the areas under the rebel, but the areas under the government control become extremely difficult to work in. And again, Taiz is a prime example of that. You worked for ICRC, you probably know this. About, I think 3 years ago, ICRC closed their mission in Taiz when one of their staff members were killed. So there was shelling of the city of Taiz during the time of the truce. So these political messages are not very helpful, because it kind of gives the impression that the Houthis are more in control. They're able to extract more concessions from the government, more concessions from the international community, just by being able to have monopoly of violence in the territory they have. It also sort of frees them up more time to recalculate and basically just decide what they want to do with their time. Now that this aid has been delivered by humanitarian organizations, they're reshuffling all of their priorities toward war. As we have seen, as soon as the truce expired, the Houthis have promised to launch regional attacks on Saudi Arabia and UAE, and that hasn't been particularly helpful. So the tone has gone up, and also we've seen that there was no political willingness on the part of the rebels to implement their promises, and all of this ended up impacting, I would say, really long-term issues like the truce and the peace in general. The final point I would make is that this was never supposed to be a permanent solution. It was supposed to build confidence among the warring parties in order for it to be a launch pad for political talks that would end the conflict in Yemen, or would just start some type of a power sharing between people. This definitely is not the case, because I truly believe that the Houthis felt that they have nothing more to offer, and that they don't want to offer what they have already. So from that perspective, this has been, again, something that is a new hurdle, both to the peace agenda, to the development agenda, and to the humanitarian agenda.
Thanks for that, and apologies for the sound issue. Fatima, both you and David have described a bifurcated situation in terms of the regional impacts of the truce, but also in terms of the general sentiment about the overall impact of this negotiated political process on a humanitarian situation. And so I want to come back to you, David. I was struck by what you said, that your colleague reported folks saying, we had better services during a period of war. Can you speak to how, in your capacity as overseeing UN operations, you can pivot now for people in the South who are still navigating the complexities of ongoing violence, but also who are not seeing the truce dividend, and talk a little bit about what the humanitarian agencies can do differently or can do going forward to respond to that sentiment expressed by the civilian population.
Yeah, thank you. I should say, just to further elaborate on my first point, which was linked to the perception of receiving food assistance, which WFP really had to reduce throughout the whole country in the period just before and after the truce. But that was really due to funding limitations, and primarily limitations coming out of UAE and Saudi Arabia, which at that point really had not kicked in. So it's a perception created by a coincidence of events, but nonetheless one that's felt. Hopefully that will partially change that attitude, but it was very unfortunate that those two things coincided because it helped create that perception. Now, more specifically to your question, I still think it's a call to action that we try to find how we could do more in that circumstance, and particularly in the Taiz area, and going all the way to the coast. I'm talking about the whole governorate, basically, over to Hodeidah governorate. I just led an interagency mission to Taiz about 2 weeks ago, I think it is now. Our intent is to establish an actual office in Taiz, which is partly symbolic, partly operational. That we want to be close to the people there. As was mentioned, it's the third largest city in the country, one that's largely neglected, frankly, and bifurcated on the north side of the city. And so we're working with the governor. I had a team come in to look at not only the humanitarian, but also the more recovery-oriented requirements of the area. And we hope to utilize that to generate interest in greater funding, particularly in areas where mine action is a big one. There's a lot of landmines in that area laid by AA forces that were pushed back at one point in time, but I've been to IDP camps surrounded by landmine fields. So that's an issue. Sanitation is a big issue, like it is in almost every city in Yemen these days. Water treatment and the treatment of waste is becoming a major health problem. Electricity is a major problem there. Access to clean water is probably the biggest problem. The unfortunate truth about Taiz is the water production has historically been on the north side, which is occupied by AA, and most of the consumers are on the south side. That no longer exists. And then, of course, they're facing a dengue fever outbreak and other health issues. They're compounded by all these other factors that I've mentioned. So I think there's a real opportunity to start addressing this. And the water issue is kind of an interesting one. We've been testing the waters, if I could make an unintended pun, on both sides to see if there's some interest in trying to reconnect water systems, which could be a contributor to building not only a better system of water, clean water access, but one that could perhaps improve the relationship and contact between both parties. And there seems to be an appetite for that. Of course, it would require monetary resources, so we continue to look for that. So I think we need to do that. We're doing this in other locations such as Al Mocha, of course, in Aden and in Hadramaut, looking at opportunities where we can go beyond just humanitarian kind of emergency support to more resilience recovery type of action, which I think people will see as more tangible benefits for peace. But let me conclude that peace dividends must come from the parties to be really confidence building. Peace dividends that come from donors do not carry the same weight. People recognize them for what they are. They appreciate it, but they know that it doesn't represent a change in attitude in the other party. And that's what really builds political confidence. That's often overlooked by donors. Donors themselves can't do that. And it has to be the parties that build a political confidence that there will be a sustained peace. And I think we have to keep our eyes on that. I've seen that in many countries where that misperception is there, that it's the donors that have to rush in and make sure that there's a peace dividend. No, it's the parties in conflict that need to do that. We can supplement, and we should, but there's nothing that substitutes for the political will for a settlement.
Thanks. I'm going to come back to you on both the funding gap question and on this nexus between the humanitarian and development work. But while we're talking about this peace dividend or the role of external parties, I want to come back to you, Fatima. There was, in some ways, somewhat of a negative tint to the discussions of the impacts of the truce here, and in your recent commentary, you wrote about the breakdown of the national dialogue and rejection of it by the Houthis. And what do you see as the political importance and the humanitarian importance, more importantly, of establishing and maintaining such a dialogue? What is the tangible benefits that we can see from a humanitarian perspective, if there are, and how should we think about that when we think about our humanitarian analysis and advocacy?
Thanks, Jacob. That's a very important question. And it's a complicated one too. So what we've observed from the Houthi militia and non-state actors in general is that they tend to advance their own interests behind closed doors. And that's where real policymaking happens. And the national dialogue was open to everyone, allowed for the discussion for everyone. And although they participated, they were more observant of the process rather than fully heartedly engaged. It allowed them the opportunity to create more deals with other informal actors and even with the former ousted president, Ali Abdullah Saleh. So in a sense, it was a counter-revolution to what people had in the Arab Spring. It backfired, and this was the national dialogue in Yemen was one of the most critical events because of its openness and its inclusiveness. But we had an event where the outcome really led to nothing but even more suffering. Part of the reason why is because of the economic factor and the public service factor. When we pay so much attention to the political process and not understanding what the people needs are on the ground are, there comes a real disconnect that other political parties can use to their advantage. I'll give you just this small story. When I was during the national dialogue, I was in Yemen monitoring food assistance by USAID, food vouchers to people in Abiyan who have been affected by the conflict and the surrounding areas, and people like in Lahj and other areas in the south of Yemen who were affected by Ansar Sharia that came in at that time around the Arab Spring prior to this conflict. And what I've realized is that people were asking me this question, is that why is the international community neglecting them and focusing all their attention on a political process in the capital where they could not eat? There was literally no food. In Lahj, big parts of it were just arable land where people lost their livelihood from agriculture. They were just selling few guavas and few limes, but had nothing else to live and survive on besides the food vouchers that were given by the humanitarian agency. And part of what I was doing for USAID is evaluating the effectiveness of the food voucher program, but also trying to find sustainable ways where we can continue this and increase the resilience of the communities. And to that, as we had focus group discussions, the sheikh and the other people were telling me there is no sustainability because they have nothing. And they were expecting us to come with answers to real structural problems that in my mind, I thought, the only way that this could be remedied is if you move out of your city to another city because there's no water. And what was even more revealing is that they had water all the way up till the 90s, until a dam was built in the city of Ib that had harvested water in that area, but stopped it from coming down to and trickling down to Lahj in the south. So everything that we do is sort of connected and has policy impacts. And as David was talking about the openness of the idea of just connecting water, I got really excited because water is one of the main sources and drivers to the conflict. So, going back to the point of, the national dialogue and what can be done, if we really need to strengthen the communities in Yemen and think about the communities, not the parties to the conflict, we need to increase also the accountability factor of pushing the people who are controlling these communities to serve them properly, because USAID, with all of its voucher programs, could not provide what these people needed. They needed, and I can imagine that their situation from 2014 until now hasn't really improved. So we need to push the government and the authorities, the de facto authorities that are there, to plan for their constituents. They cannot continue relying on humanitarian aid as a bailout. It relieves the pressures from both the government of Yemen and the militias to be responsible for the people that they're governing, and it allows them more time to fight to fight each other. So I'd highly recommend, as we're looking at dialogue processes, is looking at strengthening the community, the resiliences and the capacity through pushing the governments and the de facto authorities in the north to provide services for their citizens, and not just for their loyalists, but for all the citizens. And that's an important point I wanted to make. If I would, the last thing is maybe just to plug in for the work that Peace Track Initiative is doing in Yemen with local organizations on the issue of sort of having a sustainable roadmap for peace that would also include women's voices. As I mentioned, most of the policy making is happening, the informal policy making is happening behind closed doors. And women like me have often struggled to find access to important, sort of to push for policy agendas that affect women and that affect families in Yemen. And we're working with non-government organizations in Yemen, both in the north and the south and the east and the west, to give us their recommendations on what needs to best happen to support the peace process locally, and to help basically have a more sustainable and robust peace talks in the future.
Thanks. You talked a little bit about the need for the parties themselves to take on that role and responsibility of service provision and meeting the needs of the affected population, which I think reflects what you were talking about in terms of the peace dividends have to come from the parties themselves, and they can't be just brought in by the donors. But you also talked about what we all know of a major humanitarian funding gap, and a gap that's driven by outside factors. And so I'm kind of curious, David, if you could talk us through a little bit how you, in your position, navigate some of these dual responsibilities, in the sense that part of your function is to take that call to action and go out and drum up the necessary resources to meet those emergency humanitarian needs. And part of your hat is also political, and it's to go into some of these folks' offices and say, you need to do it. And how do you balance that tension a little bit between responding to the acute emergency needs for the affected population, while also making sure that the parties to the conflict know that they ultimately bear that responsibility, as governing authorities? So how do you reconcile that tension in your work, and how do you see that going forward?
That I hold multiple fronts, basically, but that's certainly one. That's not a message that I think has been passed too much in the past. That there's an accountability by the two parties for service delivery, simply because the crisis was of such a magnitude, and frankly the lack of a real government in the South. And unfortunately, I think we've created, or what has evolved, maybe it's a better word, over time, is an expectation that it's international assistance that has the first accountability for provision of services, not the second level. And that's the message we're now trying to get across. It's a difficult one because you're sometimes dealing with entities that want to, like in the North, they have other aims in mind with their resources, that they would like to utilize those resources for. In the South, they have restricted amounts of resources, but also internal divisions that make coherence extremely difficult, and frankly, a lack of presence in aid. And so nonetheless, we have been working on that. And for example, where we had been providing all the fuel to keep many major hospitals and water systems running throughout the country, both North and South, we decided earlier this year, with the truce, and particularly with the freedom of movement of petroleum products into the North, to phase out that particular kind of assistance and call on the authorities, particularly in the North, where they had the resources, to take that on. And we've done that so far without any negative repercussions. And I do think we need to start testing the boundaries of where humanitarian assistance is still required, and where we may be substituting for the authorities on both sides in an inappropriate way. So that's what I'm hoping we can start working on in a more comprehensive way in 2023. And I've been talking to our colleagues in the agencies in that regard. Don't want to do it too fast, because you can cause major suffering if you're not right. But I do think we can start testing it and just see how far we can push that. And secondly, of course, is you want them and both parties to accept that they have the first responsibility for that, which is often not an easy argument to sell up front, though they will privately acknowledge it in private after a clear discussion. So yeah, there's a real tension there going forward, and I think we really have to test that in the North, where I think they have both the control as well as the access to resources at this point in time. But back over to you.
Thanks. Fatima, you mentioned your work with Peace Direct. You're a board member with this organization, and thinking about this question, there is, throughout the totality of the humanitarian sector, but also in the development world, there's an acknowledgement of the need to really embrace not just the authorities here, but also those local organizations, civil society organizations, be they NGOs or community groups or otherwise. And so can you talk a little bit about what it is that Peace Direct is doing and how you see your work with these women leaders potentially helping to fill that gap between what the international humanitarian actors can provide and what the governing authorities or the de facto authorities can provide? Where's the space in Yemen for Yemeni civil society organizations to meet the needs of their neighbors and community members?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Jacob. There is an important need to support civil society organizations that are working on, critical both policy issues and life-saving issues. So through Peace Track Initiative, I've had the pleasure of connecting with many women who are working on, for example, the issue of prisoners' release. This is championed by the Mothers Abductees organization. And they work on the grassroots level. They're really involved with the UN as well, in either reporting the need, advocating for the prisoners' release, and they are to some extent involved in high-level policymaking opportunities, but not as much as we would like them to be. So pushing for more inclusion of these organizations, other organizations that are talking about women's prisoners in Ansar Allah area, or political prisoners in government area. We can also look at, women who are doing service delivery on the issues of water, on the issue of sanitation, and also women groups who are working on the economic issues, on the educational health. There is no shortage of civil society organizations, but there are some constraints that are put forward by the operating environment that they are working under. So there are constraints for people who are working under, the Houthi militia areas, and with the government, it's usually the complaint that I keep hearing over and over is that international organizations often assume the responsibility for organizations operating in government areas to either Saudi or Emirati, which is not really helpful. So more access to funding from international organization would be really something that could help more participation within the society. The IDP issue is also a critical issue that women groups are working on, and there's a deficiency in supporting humanitarian need in these areas. And finally, I would say, like, in places that are somewhat lost in limbo, like Hodeidah or Taiz. Hodeidah is lost in limbo because the Houthis maintain control over it. At the same time, the civil society organizations working in that area are having real problems in advancing their work, whether it's in working on landmine issues or on other citizen participation. And in Taiz, the humanitarian organization there are having a problem in both funding and access because they are trapped within the city. So as much as we can, we try to highlight their voices. And one of the things that Peace Track is working on at the moment is taking feedback from all of these organizations that we're working with and having that feed into a paper of a feminist peace roadmap. And what the roadmap does is that the aim for it is that really to give people like the UN resident coordinator David, or the UN envoy to Yemen, or the US envoy to Yemen, an idea of what would be the best way to negotiate on political issues using women voices that have long been marginalized. So you don't have to meet every one of us, but be sure that all of the voices of maybe around 800 women are reflected in that document. And I think that's really some critical work. And again, I'll emphasize that we work with everyone and not just with, people in government controlled area.
Thanks. Thanks very much for that. And you spoke to the need for the financial resources not to replace these organizations, but to support them. And David, you talked about the funding gap and getting those contributions from external actors, and in particular, in this case, for the contributions from the Saudis and the Emiratis. And I'm just wondering a little bit, when you take your message outside of Sana, what has resonated, and what should we be thinking about? What messages should we be putting out there to close this gap, and how does the gap impact the work of the UN agencies? Our program here in Washington is global, right? We do these events on all sorts of different contexts, and regularly we start with, this is a terrible humanitarian crisis and there's a huge funding gap. And people can point to all sorts of reasons: the economic impacts of COVID-19, the reduction of spending by the Brits and some other traditional donors, the impact of Ukraine in particular, but something's got to give. And actually, we all need to sort of think about how we can generate more funding for these devastating humanitarian crises. So when you think about going in front of donors or thinking about messages that resonate, what would be your top lines to re-engage and reinvigorate that sense of urgency for the funding that's necessary where humanitarian action is a solution?
Well, ironically, let's start off with some facts. We're currently at $2.4 billion mobilized out of, which is roughly 56%. So not actually at all different than last year, even though we got no funding from the UAE and reduced funding from Saudi Arabia. Why? Because we got, among the Europeans, not a bad increase, despite Ukraine. There's a perception that's Ukraine that's the factor, but in fact, European countries have contributed more. The United States doubled practically its contribution from around 500 plus to over $1 billion this year, which made up for the regional gap that I described. So I think those donors have been receptive to the discussions that we've had. Key to that was which I believe it was the first time that we've had comprehensive humanitarian assistance assessments, across all 333 districts in the country, which gave an evidence base that did not exist before, that confirmed more or less what had been said before, but gave a higher level of confidence that was an accurate reflection of the current situation. And I think that was fundamental to securing the kind of resources that we have. Secondly, there's a need to demonstrate that we're actively looking for diversion of this assistance, because that's the most common rationale for not providing funding, particularly in the region. And so I do think we have to reinvigorate not only our efforts, but also our ability to describe those efforts so that that doesn't become a rationale for cutting assistance. The third argument I hear against assistance, largely in the region, but not exclusively, is what's the exit strategy for the humanitarian assistance? There is no end in sight. Nothing changes. Well, two things I would say to that. Actually, things do change. Number one, this year, we projected at the beginning of 2022, 160,000 plus people in IPC 5, which is putting you on the doorstep of famine. Our current projection is now 0. So effectively, we've averted famine. IPC 3 and above, the projection was 2 million higher than our current projection. So 2 million people left that IPC 3, 4, and 5 category over the last few months. So the assistance does work, and it works at pushing things in the right direction. The second thing I say is, it's not for the humanitarians to end a crisis. It's for the international community and the parties in conflict to end the conflict so that we can rebuild and get out of the humanitarian crisis that we face. But no amount of humanitarian assistance will end the need for humanitarian assistance. It's life-saving is the intent. So we need to have a very careful narrative. And then secondly, more broadly, we need to understand what's driving the attitude of those who are not contributing as they have in the past, because it's not just linked to the questions I raised. There's some many political considerations about what should be done. Is there still a belief in humanitarian assistance, which is a question mark with the UAE? And what are the political calculations of the parties? I mean, we hear from UAE, for example, we don't see anything in this for us when we provide humanitarian assistance, which kind of defeats the whole point of humanitarian assistance. So I think some higher level political discussions to try to see if those views, perceptions can be changed will be important. Prospects for 2023 is not your question, but maybe it's implied. I'm not so optimistic because I don't think the United States, though I hope they would, but they're not likely to be able to sustain the same amount of funding coming in as it did this year. It was pretty much a one-off because of the Ukraine situation. And the gaps that I've described regionally will likely stay. The global economy is not strong, so it's going to be difficult to maintain and let alone increase European contributions. So it's going to be much more difficult in 2023 to sustain where we are today. So we have our work cut out for us, quite frankly. And then if you would, just give me 1 second to maybe complement the prior point on local organizations, and just to let you know that we use our Yemen Humanitarian Fund, which is now about $100 million for the current year. About almost 60% of that funding goes to directly, not through NGOs or UN agencies, but directly to national organizations. And we have like 100 or so that we work with. And I had a couple of objectives in mind with that. One is to continue to work on the right kind of capacity building. One of the common critiques we have with our capacity building is that we build capacity to write grants, but not necessarily to manage procurement and programs and so forth. And there's a demand that capacity building be modified. Number two, we tend to focus on those NGOs that are more headquartered in Aden and in Sana'a, particularly in the south. It's important to talk to the NGOs that are in Marib and Taiz and others that are quite active. And so we're doing outreach by having people based in those locations to help them identify potential grants that we can fund. And then thirdly, we're requiring that a percentage of the funding go to women-led organizations, and we're encouraging our participation on our advisory board as well as the humanitarian country team to have representatives from women-led organizations to make sure those voices are up front and center in our own policy making as we go forward. I thought that might be of interest, so I just added that. Back over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much. That's really good to hear. And in an otherwise bleak picture, at least the figures that you shared on the food security picture being not quite as dire, I think are positive trends. And there's probably a lot of analysis to be done on the role of the truce, the role of the humanitarian action, but together, the fact that those numbers of people have come off those roles, I think is really important. Certainly there's work for the humanitarian community to do with donors to get out of a what's in it for us mentality. And I think that's a pretty important call for action for folks who have dialogue opportunities with donors, to remind them of the humanitarian imperative, their obligations under international humanitarian law and others, what the goal of humanitarian assistance is for. And thanks for flagging the Yemen Humanitarian Fund. So let me just turn it to you, Fatima, maybe for some final thoughts and comments. As you think about the path forward, I mean, what would be a key takeaway or key point you would want to resonate with listeners from the U.S. government or across the policy spectrum as people think about 2023 and beyond for Yemen? What's kind of your top line message for folks thinking about this humanitarian crisis?
I think we've seen some positive changes in the past during the truce. We've seen some positive changes that really need to be maintained. And one of the greatest positive changes is really the transparency from the United Nations in discussing, issues that it has often not discussed in the past by sort of just, maintaining maybe a neutral role that did not assign responsibility to the parties whenever they committed violations. And I think the increased transparency helped in building trust. So the leadership that we have seen from the United Nations and from the United States is really a welcome change, and that's great. With respect to pushing on peace talks and on the peace process, they should continue always being on the agenda, regardless of any truce agreement. We should be always pushing to find a way out of this quagmire, and not use, any type of formal agreement or confidence building measure to have, achieve our objectives in humanitarian aid or in stability for the country. It's hard to be optimistic about the future of Yemen, given the different variables that are there. But I would say is that we really cannot push Yemenis to accept a solution that they're not ready for. And therefore, we must find ways for them to talk to each other. But if that doesn't happen, we cannot force it. I think an element of that was forced during the Stockholm agreement, which it's too late to talk about right now. But the current agreement has been, I think, a little bit more mature in not pushing the parties, not pushing the Yemen government to accept, presenting more concession than is needed. So, with that, I think I'll close probably with just being really hopeful that the international community is going to take more of a leadership role in attempting to push the parties positively to end the conflict.
Thank you for that and for your contributions today. You've both given us a lot to think about, a lot to digest in terms of how we harmonize the political agendas while not losing focus of the humanitarian agenda, how we do the humanitarian action differently, how we engage those local voices in a meaningful way, putting the perspectives of the civilian population forward. So let me just say once again, thank you to Fatima Abou Asrar from Middle East Institute